Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to our conversation today with Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond on strategies for preparing and developing effective principals and school leaders. Please note that this recording is the latest in a series of 12 other NGA webinars on educator workforce challenges and opportunities, including with other key noted experts in the field, Dr. Constance Lindsay, Dr. Paul Manna, Dr. Steve Tozer, and Dr. Jackie Wilson. These webinars are supported by and in partnership with the Wallace Foundation. The Wallace Foundation works to support principal and school leader preparation, development, and support across the country. Their Wallace Knowledge Center has multiple resources, tools, and reports on state strategies for school leadership, including the reports we're going to discuss today with Dr. Darling-Hammond. You can find these resources at wallacefoundation.org or through a direct link on the NGA K-12 Education webpage. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, a leading expert in this and so many other areas of K-12 education policy and education policy overall. Dr. Darling-Hammond is founding president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute and Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education, Emeritus at Stanford University. She led the education policy transition team for both President Obama in 2008 and for President Biden in 2020, and she currently serves as president of the California State Board of Education, serving as an advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom on K-12 education policy. So with that introduction, let's dive into the conversation with Dr. Darling-Hammond. Dr. Darling-Hammond, it is great to have you with us today. And so just a foundational question to start. Why should governors focus on principal and school leader preparation and development and make sure that it's part of the competing priorities, the budget priorities that they have at hand? What does the research tell us about why it's so important to invest in principals and school leaders? Why are they critical for student and teacher and school success?
Yeah. Well, we often hear the statement that, teachers are the largest in-school contribution to student achievement. But what teachers can do depends on what their principals are able to do. And we also know with new data that principals' influences on student learning, on teacher retention, and on teacher practice are extremely large, that they are a very important part of the investment. And in fact, if you want schools to operate well, you have to be thinking about the way in which principals are prepared, the kind of ongoing professional development they get for this extremely challenging job. And we're really having to reinvent schools in a lot of ways, to redesign them from the factory model of 100 years ago. And principals have to also lead that. They have to lead that change process and that relationship with the local community, as well as with all of the other partners. So I would just say that it's one of the most important areas for investment, and it's actually one that's gotten the least attention until very recently, because we focused on many other pieces of the system, not realizing that what you can do to transform schools is going to rest very, very much on the knowledge and skills of that principal.
Thank you, Dr. Darling-Hammond. Just really helpful for thinking about not only the principal as leader of that school, but how they impact the community around that school as well, and the teachers in that school. Now we know one pressing issue so much is around educator shortages and retention challenges. What has research shown, particularly around principal impact on teacher shortages and retention?
Well, this is really interesting. And one of the things we confirmed in our study is that principals have a very substantial impact on teacher recruitment and retention. And in fact, principals themselves turn over frequently in some places. And that then has a disruptive effect on the entire school. So quite often, if there is principal turnover, we've seen some places where you might get 4 or 5 principals in the course of 4 or 5 years. I mean, where the turnover is very steady. You'll see teacher retention go down. You'll see student achievement go down. One of the other things we found is that principal preparation, the quality of the preparation, impacts how long the principal stays in the job, how well prepared they are to do it, and whether they feel that they can manage it, they feel efficacious, determines how long they stay. We also, in looking at the direct effects on teacher retention, found that a well-prepared principal, one who has had a very high quality preparation, which includes an internship under the wing of an expert principal and includes training on instructional leadership and change management and organizational development, will actually measurably improve the rate of teacher retention from year to year. And in one example, we sort of modeled, if you have a principal with high quality preparation versus one with low quality preparation, the average teacher retention the following year will be close to 90% for the first principal and closer to 78% for the second principal. So there's a big differential that can occur when principals don't know how to support teachers, how to make that environment inviting and supportive for what is a very hard job, for teachers as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, so principal turnover certainly impacting teacher turnover, and then principal preparation, a high quality principal preparation programs and opportunities really can help to stem a lot of that turnover. And so to look for the quality of those preparation programs and provide more opportunities for that to happen for principals coming in and on the job. Last year, you released a new report from Wallace Foundation, Developing Effective Principals, What Kind of Learning Matters. What were the key findings of that report, and what were the implications, would you say, for governors and states as part of it?
Well, obviously, the first finding is that principal preparation matters in lots of ways. We reviewed all of the research that met a reasonable standard of quality since about 2007. That looked at what kind of principal preparation matters for the principal's ability to recruit and retain teachers, as well as the student achievement and other practices that principals engage in that are known to be effective. We also looked at the same thing for professional development. And what we found was that, first of all, the content matters. Principals need to know about and benefit from learning about instructional leadership, organizational development, including the development of people, how you support learning for staff inside the school, dealing with the needs of diverse learners. Turns out to be a very important and increasingly important area of learning, as well as change management. How do you help a school change and improve? So those areas of content turn out to be very important. And then in addition to that, how principals have the opportunity to learn makes a difference. So, just sitting in a lecture hall, reading books and hearing lectures is not enough to take on this kind of job effectively. Some of the things that really matter for principals' effectiveness later is whether they're getting applied learning, whether they're getting to do action research projects, whether they're getting to do the kinds of things they'll have to do as a principal, learn how to engage in feedback to teachers or evaluation, or how to support professional development. So action projects that get people involved in those kinds of things, case studies that allow them to understand how to make decisions under certain circumstances. And then very, very important in pre-service principal preparation is the internship, where a principal would be under the wing of an expert principal, especially if they can be in the district they're going to be moving into, to learn the ropes and take on leadership responsibilities, not just imagine what they might do, but actually have to take those on. And quite often in these internships, principals will be charged with working with a team of teachers to help improve their practice, or charged with a school improvement initiative that they need to undertake with that expert principal right there, guiding them over the course of ideally a full year. Also very important for principals in practice is when the professional development they get is accompanied by coaching and mentoring. Mentoring for those beginning principals as they're learning the ropes, again with an expert voice and sounding board. and then coaching around specific strategies that they're trying to learn how to do. And when those things are present, we see strong effects of both preparation and professional development on principal practices, on teacher satisfaction and their view of whether the school is a good place, and on outcomes at the school level. So those are important elements of the process. The other thing is that we found that some of the things that are most important and most valued are least available. We looked at what were principals actually getting across the country. And the number of principals who get access, for example, to coaching and mentoring is well under half. And the number of principals who get an internship that they feel really prepares them for the job is still under half. So we're making some progress, but we really have to lean in and be much more conscious of how to get the practices in place that will help principals be at their most effective, which is what can allow schools to be at their most effective.
Thank you, Dr. Darling-Hammond. And I think, you really, reference these actionable experiences that principals need to have to learn from each other. And so internships, coaching, mentorships, to be able to have those actionable experiences. And so in addition to kind of investing in some of those opportunities, in terms of states and governors and what they can do to sort of facilitate, are there additional ways that you would mention around governors and states being able to facilitate those kind of opportunities happening for principals?
Well, there's a growing amount of state level policy around the principalship. And in fact, when ESSA, came out and there was, a set aside that states could take to support school leadership. Many of them did decide to use that for a variety of purposes, ranging from, mentoring beginning principals to creating a capacity to train turnaround teams, not just the principal, but also the assistant principal and teacher leaders around a turnaround agenda and help them move school improvement forward. There are lots of states that are now investing in the pre-service side of preparation and more professional development for principals. Some of the really noteworthy projects that we've seen at the state level include things like the North Carolina Principal Fellows Program, started many years ago, in which they will give funding in partnership with districts for principals to be, prospective principals to be identified from among dynamic teachers who are already taking a lot of leadership. They get 2 years of a master's degree program in several of the universities in North Carolina and a full year of internship with the salary paid in part by the state, in part by the district. And the district, as I've already said, these are people we want to hire as principals, so we want to invest in them. And then they get that year under the wing of the expert, principal. What some recent studies have found, years into this, is that the folks who came through North Carolina Principal Fellows Program get into the principalship sooner, because a lot of people who get credentials don't ever go into the principalship, but virtually all of them went into the principalship. They got there sooner, they stayed longer, and they were and their schools looked to be gaining in effectiveness over this course of time. So those investments, which have been going on for a couple of decades, have really paid off. There's a similar approach in Illinois, which required an internship for beginning principals and then initially funded that so that there was a way for people to get that experience without having to, go into debt and have no salary, for a year. Delaware is one of the places that started a leadership academy, but there are many of them across the country that really looks at the process of incoming principals and makes sure that they get mentoring in their first years on the job and that they get principal networks where they can share with other principals. So there are lots of things that states can do, and many states are engaged in very creatively figuring out how to make those investments. And as I said, a lot of them are putting in place leadership academies. that can take on many roles. And in fact, their roles can change over time as needed to, ensure that there is a knowledge base that is getting shared across the schools or across principals, that there may be networks of principals who are working in similar contexts, rural principals who are working together to figure out how to solve those problems, urban principals, high school principals working with others. All of these things make principals more effective and can be supported by states in ways that have effects at scale rather than just one, school at a time.
That's really helpful, and I appreciate you naming particular programs or states that have made movement on this. And so just to, spotlight again, so Illinois, North Carolina, Delaware are a few of those programs, and we'll make sure to include those in the resources, some of those examples. I wanted to just take a step back and, note that this report you released last year was an update to your influential 2007 report. I remember when it came out and we were on Capitol Hill, and it really did influence the writing early on of the Average Student Succeeds Act, and eventually made some of that language into the law. But it was preparing school leaders for a changing world, lessons from the Exemplary Leadership Development Program. So what in your mind has changed the most in the intervening years between the two reports, between 2007 and last year? And how have you seen the role of the principal? I think you've spoken a little bit to this, but how have you seen it evolve over time? And especially with the pandemic in between, what have you seen the impact on principals and school leaders?
Well, sort of starting in the early 2000s, what we've seen is a lot more attention to standards, and there are now national standards that have been created by the profession that most states have adopted. Those standards, which have evolved over time, have more focus on student learning, more focus on equity, which were not even on the radar scope for principal training at a moment in time a couple of decades ago. Principals are getting more opportunity to learn the content that is viewed as important. Those elements of how to lead as an instructional leader, those elements of which, again, was not on the agenda 20 years ago for very many states, how to help teachers develop, how to develop staff as a whole, how to manage change, how to look at the needs of diverse. There's a set of content areas we surveyed principals on. We were partnering with the National Associations of Elementary and Secondary Principals, and they helped us get a large-scale survey nationally. And then we looked specifically at a couple of states that also had surveys, and we could see that there was much more access to these areas of content. And that's a good thing, more professional development in most states. But we also saw that much less progress on getting access to those high quality learning strategies, like applied learning, like action research and case studies and internships and coaching. So we're making progress on content. We need to make more progress on the kind of learning that's effective. Principals are more knowledgeable. There are more of them that are getting pre-service training. We're up to about 60% of principals now who get training before they come into the profession. That still means, however, there are about 40% of people coming in, trying to figure out as they go. And that's a big opportunity loss in terms of what could be happening for them. And so we really need to be leaning in some of the places where folks aren't getting that training. We're also seeing huge differentials across states. So on the one hand, you've got the national data, which shows some progress. We saw when we compared, for example, California, which happened to have a recent survey with many of those same items, and North Carolina, which had one, very big differentials in terms of California principals getting much more access. There have been recent investments in professional development and much more equitable access. No disparity by low and high poverty schools, whereas in most parts of the country, and definitely true in North Carolina, there were big disparities. And principals in the highest need schools were getting much less access to the kind of training they need to take on bigger challenges than principals in lower poverty schools. So we have to attend both to access and equity in the opportunities that principals have to learn.
Thank you. That's such great insights. And it really just seems like there's been that change, like you were saying, from a lot of progress, but still a lot of ways to go. And this change from building manager plus instructional leader, maybe not giving up that building manager piece, but also adding on sort of the instructional duties of a principal as well, has been a big change there. And you mentioned some of the state models: North Carolina, Delaware, Illinois. Are there other models or approaches you would point to, especially given your experience in California? It sounds like from the report there's been a lot of movement there in the intervening years as well.
So California, a number of years ago, started to overhaul everything in its system. New standards were adopted, new funding system was adopted, new expectations for teachers and principals in the licensing and accreditation space were adopted, and performance assessments for both teachers and principals before they could enter the workforce were also put in place, so that you could see whether teachers could plan a curriculum and teach the curriculum and evaluate student learning. You could see if a principal could plan a school improvement process, could work with teachers around professional learning, in these performance assessments. And so that was all happening in the sort of 2010s, through beginning in about 2012, 13 and going forward from there. And in the standards revision process, there was more attention to understanding children as whole children, social and emotional as well as academic learning, being able to focus on how to teach the new standards, deeper learning, more higher order thinking skills development, et cetera. And one of the things we found in the data that we looked at was that principals trained later in the decade felt much better prepared for all of those things, felt they'd gotten more access to that kind of training in their professional learning opportunities, were more likely to get a useful internship, and were more likely to have that knowledge base in hand. So it does show that these kinds of strategies at the state level can make a difference in what principals, know and are able to do. We've also seen more attention to induction of principals. California created a 2-year induction requirement for principals in which they must get some kind of coaching and mentoring. We're studying that right now and finding that, yes, principals are very grateful for that mentoring and feel like it is really helping them become more effective right away. Pennsylvania took a very different approach, and they worked with the National Institute for School Leadership, known affectionately as NISL. They work in a number of states and have developed a program of induction. They offer courses, a course of study, sort of a seminar series, and principals study certain aspects and go off and work on those and come back and debrief together. And they also get mentors connected to them to help them with that process. They focus a lot on how people learn, how students learn, and what do you need to do in the environment as well as in the classroom to support student learning, which is, a really big shift in principal training. And there's several studies of their work that find strong effects on student learning gains for the principals who've had opportunity to experience that kind of induction. I mentioned that there are a number of places that have been doing leadership academies: South Carolina, Georgia. Many places are doing very interesting work in those academies. Arizona has a principals academy that helps all of the principals, assistant principals, and others learn how to support teacher evaluation and feedback and support. Utah also has an approach in their Department of School Leadership that helps folks understand how to engage in teacher evaluation in a constructive, productive way that also supports the learning process. There's something also similar in West Virginia. So there are lots of different strategies. And sometimes what states will do is figure out where are we now in our process of improving schools generally, and what is it that principals will need to know, and then how do we help them get access to that learning. In California, we're now going to universal preschool for 4-year-olds, and we asked our School Leadership Academy to work with elementary principals who are going to bring 4-year-olds into the building and really start to understand early childhood education so that they'd be prepared for that kind of a shift. So some of it is what you might do on an ongoing regular basis, and some of it is tied to state policy that is trying to advance various aspects of the education system.
That's a really great point, to make sure that you're connecting this work around school leadership and even educators to the overall policy agenda that you're having in the state, and make sure there's that connective tissue there. And again, I appreciate you mentioning a number of different state models, including the induction ones for California and Pennsylvania, and then highlighting South Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Utah, West Virginia, all doing different efforts, different approaches, but all aimed towards principal preparation, development, and support. As we sort of end up here, what would you say for a governor state interested in moving this work forward? What would be your number one sort of piece of advice, or 3 pieces of advice you would say to them prior to getting started that they should think about on the front end?
Well, I mean, the first thing is always to take stock of what you're already doing. States build up a geological dig of policy over time. So first thing is to say, where are we? What have we already done? Are there things that could be expanded or made, taken to scale that are working well in this state, rather than necessarily assuming that you're going to start something brand new that might bump up against other things that are in the field. And then, of course, take stock of your needs. It would be a great idea to survey leaders, in the state to find out what they feel their needs are, what they feel they're getting and not getting, so that you can think about that. Sometimes if you don't have one, developing a leadership academy can be a useful way to build some infrastructure that then you can use to address some of the needs that are going on. And I would say there are about maybe 15 states that have leadership academies at this juncture. Of course, there are other ways to do the work, sometimes in partnership as well with professional associations that are already working in this space. The group that represents principals, elementary principals or secondary principals or school administrators generally, et cetera. So all of those are kind of starting points to get the ball rolling. And I think, this question of how do principals come into the profession? What are the standards? One of the big tools that states have is the tool for licensing and accreditation of programs. And often it's underused. What are your standards for what people should know and be able to do? Those could always be upgraded to the current needs. What are the standards and the processes for evaluating programs and accrediting or approving them to say that they can operate? And do those incorporate the content that's needed? Do they incorporate the learning strategies that are needed? A lot of states have made big progress by changing those standards and then sunsetting old programs and say you can continue to practice. I mean, obviously there's a time frame and nobody goes away overnight, and people have an opportunity to redesign, to incorporate the new standards. And those that do that, then are continually approved. But there's a lot changing in schools. And, if we're not also keeping up with the needs that schools have in the way in which we're preparing leaders, and then, finding a way to be sure that everyone gets access to that preparation. And that may also mean putting in place sort of the financial aid or other strategies that allow people to come into the profession. And the last thing I would say about state leadership here is think about how to partner with districts and county offices, whatever your system is for geographic work, regional work. because what is really effective is when districts identify those, dynamic teachers and other staff that they want to bring in to the profession, and then create with the state resources a process by which they're identifying those folks, supporting them, hiring them, and then continuing a pipeline of support. We see that those kinds of things, in fact, Wallace Foundation created a pipeline project which allows people to kind of move from the teacher leadership role to the principal, assistant principal, and principal role, and on that all the way up to a central office leadership. When those things are coordinated and coherent, then you can get really, really strong effects on leader knowledge, skills, behavior, and effectiveness in the schools.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thinking about what are you doing already in your state, thinking about the needs that you have, the stakeholders that you'll need to move it forward, including the districts and the professional associations that perhaps are already doing this work, and some of the infrastructure building that can be done on the pipeline in terms of leadership academies, the program approval standards, the licensing, the accreditation. So just really identifying some high level practices there that governors and states can look at. Always like to end on an optimistic note. In particular, where do you see your work in the field headed next? What are you most excited about going forward?
Well, there's just been recent bubbling around equity-focused leadership. We're beginning to see programs bringing that in place. We're beginning to see professional development around that concept. We learned in our study that principals who had access to those kinds of opportunities really benefited from them. It shaped the way they proceeded. So I'm excited to look further at what can we do in that area. LPI is also doing a study right now on racial equity leadership. And we're partnering with the Southern Education Foundation, where they train some mostly leaders from the South to become leaders of racial equity. And we've been studying some of those leaders and what they do, what the leadership moves are, and what the districts have been able to accomplish. And I think that will inform the kind of preparation and training that might evolve in the field. So I'm very excited about that. I'm also excited about the fact that I think one of the things that happened in the pandemic was that we really recognized the need to find ways to build schools that can really deal with the whole child, that can really support all the aspects of children's development, social, emotional, physical, cognitive, academic. We know from the science that those are all very tightly linked, that you learn better in a school where you feel supported in particular ways, where there are structures for strong relationships. And that's going to require some school redesign so that we're building the kind of environments that allow for that, which the factory model was not designed for. So we've been pushing on that model and trying to make it more than it was intended to be. And I'm seeing across the country that the schools that succeeded during the pandemic had those kinds of new designs in place. Community schools, where they were already working very closely with families. They were working with different community-based organizations, bringing them into not just after school spaces, but sometimes, throughout the day, where they were really wrapping around students. And many of those schools, have really flourished in ways that others have struggled to be able to do. In California, we have an initiative called Linked Learning, and it's a high school reform where smaller academies work with business and industry, medical science, law and social policy, STEM careers, et cetera. And kids are getting both a college preparatory and an applied, experiential, industry-oriented component of their education. They have small advisories where there are family groups who, groups of students who share an advisor who connects to their family and meets with them regularly for social and emotional learning and support, for academic support, connecting them to the resources that they may need to catch up in a subject or to continue to do well. They were involved in project-based learning when the pandemic hit, and they continued to be engaged, attending, succeeding, moving graduation rates forward. And these kinds of designs are going to need principals who understand how we're going to move from an old factory model, stamp every kid with the same lesson in a standardized way, to a school that is really organized around a very engaging learning for higher order thinking skills and personalized supports for students.
Well, thanks, Dr. Darling-Hammond. And I really like how you're saying that, that the focus right now on academic supports and student well-being, it does come back though still to educator preparation and professional learning and development and support. And that includes principal preparation, development, and support. So thank you so much for the conversation today and sharing your expertise and insights. And viewers, please note that all reports and resources discussed during this webinar will be attached to the recording once it's posted to the NGA website. So thanks again, Dr. Darling-Hammond. Until next time, thanks for tuning in and have a great day.